Welcome to the Modern Athenas podcast with Sonia and Debbie, where we discuss how regular women became Athenas in their own time by working hard, persevering through the challenges in their lives, and contributing to a better world. This is podcast 21. In this podcast, we will be discussing the book A Little More About Me by Pam Houston. You can use a link on our website at modernathenas.com to order the book after the podcast. Pam Houston is a well-known fiction writer. In A Little More About Me, Pam uses essays to tackle the transformative moments in her life and to reflect on the decisions she has made and the various twists and turns her life journey has taken. She guides the reader through her love of dogs and what they can show us as humans, her love of the outdoors, thoughts about men, her reflection of her own body, some deeply personal moments, and her travels around the world, including Africa, the Andes, and Bhutan. As Pam takes the reader on this journey, we see that she refuses to ever give up her dreams and refuses to settle for what others' expectations are of her. Time after time, she bravely steps into the unknown to challenge herself and to search for who she truly is and who she truly wants to be. Pam embodies Athena's perseverance, bravery through challenges, fortitude, and drive. Most women, by the time they hit their mid-30s, are starting to settle down. They start families, they buy homes, they make roots. Pam struggled with this transition. Quote, "Happy to be alive adrenaline is a powerful and addicting substance, and I've had a lifetime's worth of it, in less than half a lifetime's years. But I can't deny the unadulterated joy I have felt in each adventure, a joy so pure it must be separate from the addiction. Sitting safe on the other side of those high-risk years, there isn't one heart-stopping moment I would have wanted to miss out on, not one where the life experience gains in retrospect didn't exceed the terror and discomfort level at the time. Our mid-30s is the time when most of us stop bouncing and start breaking. I've been trying for these last few years to find a way to hold on to the joy of adventuring, while I also try and shed my penchant for unnecessary risk." End quote. And so as she's writing this book, she's sort of struggling with this idea of, she's watching all of her friends sort of settle down. And, in the era of social media, it's easier to sort of watch this happen with everybody, that you go to college with, and you see all these pictures, and you attend all these marriages of all your friends. And, for someone like me, who was kind of a late bloomer and I was late to settle down, and now, I don't have kids, and it's, you kind of feel like your clock is ticking and life is passing you by, and everybody else is kind of settling.
Yeah, it seems like she's kind of spending some time right now thinking about her decisions, but not necessarily with any regret, but just kind of analyzing them and wondering, what's next for her. But I think she shows a lot of kind of intention in her decisions and trying to make them really meaningful.
Yeah, I think it's hard because I think that, she goes through this period of are my decisions right? And I think everybody goes through this. I definitely did. This it's not really regret as much as it's this sort of, and it's not indecision, but it's like, am I doing the right thing? Is this right? And then you kind of get over that, and it's this kind of crest, and you get to this point where it's like, no, I'm doing the right thing for myself. And, maybe it's a wanderlust lifehood that you have, but it's what you want, and you kind of become a little bit more comfortable in your own skin. And you see that as this book progresses, and she kind of goes on these adventures, and she kind of grows more comfortable with herself and with her life choices. Pam talks often in the book about living life on the edge. As she describes her adventures around the world and around some of the most picturesque mountains and rivers in the U.S., you get a sense that for her, living life on the edge is about the dichotomy between safety and risk, between comfort and the uncomfortable. But as she started to get older, she started to wonder whether living on the physical edge was really still about success and not listening to fear, or whether, after so many years, the edge was no longer as sharp as it had once been. She starts to reevaluate her risk-taking. Quote, "How many times can you walk to the same edge and find it interesting? And now that I've begun to step back off the one that was once my nemesis, I see new, more interesting edges everywhere I look. Artistic, spiritual, emotional, even physical edges that don't necessarily involve risking my life." End quote. And so early on, all of her sort of edges in life, or these challenges that she had were all physical. And now as she's beginning to get older and she's stepping back from some of those, she's seeing these challenges or these other edges that are in different areas of her life.
I've definitely felt kind of that change in perspective from leaving my 20s and going into my 30s, and even these first 5 years of my 30s, trying to just find a broader perspective. And like she talks about those edges maybe not seeming so sharp. Like I've also felt kind of this pull to not necessarily feel like I need to be right all the time, but try to seek out more meaning in the relationships and moments that make up my life.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because in some way, I think that physical edges are actually safer than some of the other types of edges because with physical edges, you can kind of see them. It's like, oh, I'm going to climb this mountain, and you can kind of at least anticipate the challenges that you're going to have, and you can kind of see like, okay, here's how I'm going to climb it. Here's how I can be safe. Here are the possible dangers. And some of these other edges, like emotional edges, you can't really, they're amorphous. You can't really know what's going to happen. They're just going to be unanticipated things that come up. And so I think they're riskier and I think that people fear them more. And so I think that they're harder for people to sort of engage in. And so I think, people hesitate a little bit more to sort of step off or try them.
I would definitely agree with that. As you're talking about kind of these tangible edges, I respond really well to like being able to make a plan, whether there's a date on the calendar and create like a timeline and checklist. I am in my element if I can create a timeline and checklist. But these kind of intangible edges, like you're talking about, those I feel definitely are much more uncertain and can create anxiety.
Yeah, and I think it's odd because I think as we get older, we gain more tools to be able to deal with those sort of intangible edges. And at the same time, they're almost scarier because we have more to lose, right? So we have more experience. So we have almost more coping mechanisms and more abilities to handle the different things that may arise. As we're sort of navigating them, but we also have a lot of other things going on in our life, whether it's kids or a home or a career. So there's a lot more at risk. Pam writes a group of essays in the book about dogs. She describes the dogs that used to roam freely in Park City, Utah. Their owners were part of a collective mindset that the dogs were freest and happiest when they were able to roam as part of a pack, rather than leashed and restrained. She also describes her own dogs, each of whom has a unique personality and philosophy on life. In one example, Pam describes the stark differences in her dogs when thunderstorms hit. One hides under the bed, one acts brave, and one sits outside, mesmerized by nature's wrath. The dogs, one could argue, are the same as children, each of them special and unique with their own way of handling challenges and obstacles. They each bring something different to the pack and form their own relationships with themselves, other children, and their parents. As Pam describes some of the harsher conditions that her dogs lived before she rescued them, she comments that, quote, "A happy puppyhood is as hard to rattle as a traumatic one is to get over," end quote. She notes that dogs seem immune to abuse and hatred. No matter how much abuse is directed at them, they still return, always willing to love if given the chance. Couldn't the same be said for children? And she talks a lot in the book about dogs, very clearly sort of opening the reader to this analogy that you can draw, dogs to children or dogs to sort of other groups of people. But it's sort of this idea that dogs are indestructible to sort of whatever trauma that you give them, and sort of looking at these sort of innocent types of groups like children and sort of their indestructibility.
I also took that word indestructible maybe also to mean resilience. And we had a dog, Bubbles. She passed away a year ago as an old lady, but we got her as a rescue. And we don't know much about her former life, but she was clearly so scared and had been malnourished and everything. But we saw her come to life like within the first year of us having her. And it's like, if given the opportunity, that resilience can really shine too. And I think it takes time though for probably these dogs and also children and all of us to kind of bounce back and from traumatic things. But it was really such a delight to be able to see kind of probably what was her true personality come through, even though it had been kind of challenged and limited and beaten down from whatever her past life was.
First of all, I just love that name, Bubbles. But second, I think that there's also something to be said for this like pack mentality, and the fact that a pack can actually help people through trauma and can, help with that resiliency and bringing that true personality through. And I think it's not only true for children, but it could also be true for adults, and going through trauma and surrounding yourself with some kind of a network or a pack, whatever that may be, family, friends, and it can really, I think, help support you through.
Well, and I think also in a pack, there's I would imagine, I don't know much about dog hierarchy, but they talk about like the different roles that dogs play or in a pack, and there's a purpose for each of the dogs in the pack, but they're only they're stronger because they are part of a pack. So kind of like what you were talking about, draw on that support network. It also gives purpose and a role to someone more so than if they were alone.
Exactly. Pam describes the way Park City, Utah used to be before the tourists arrived. Full of locals and dreamers, residents often arrive with their sights set on adventure on the snowy mountain slopes or on the difficult summer hiking trails. Those who came rarely left. Although they were not wealthy in money, they were wealthy in happiness. As years passed, Park City began to experience growth and the local vibes started to change. At first, it was a Walmart moving in. Then it became development, the land purchased from longtime locals at a price too high to refuse. Local construction workers started to become financially wealthy by assisting the developers with the construction of new businesses and homes. The new homes started encroaching on the open land and started constricting the city. The downtown began to change from local bars and restaurants to sushi restaurants and wine clubs. As Park City changed, Pam found herself becoming more and more distant. Eventually, she realized that she was outgrowing Park City. But was she outgrowing Park City, or was Park City outgrowing her? Either way, she decided it was time to move on. So, like many people, there was an old Park City, right, and a new Park City. So she'd come to Park City when it was still this sort of full of locals and dreamers, and it wasn't a hippie town, but it was definitely sort of one of these very, when you think of one of these sort of outdoorsy types of places, it was definitely like that. And then in comes sort of all the development. And there's a lot of places that have turned into that type of city or community out west here, as the financial booms have hit and as sort of cities have started to flood out into more rural areas, and technology has improved and access has sort of started to open up. And as these places have happened, it started to push out some of these sort of more quaint, if you want to use that word, areas. And as it's done that, you start to wonder, as we move and these places change, do we outgrow, what we've known, or do the places change and so they're sort of outgrowing us?
I was kind of thinking of it in the sense that sometimes it can seem like we change if our surroundings change, but I think in the case of Pam, it's like as the surroundings were changing around her, she started to maybe realize more her own individuality and could make decisions about who she wanted to be in light of the environment changing around her.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when your environment changes like that dramatically, I think it forces you to take a look at, who you are and what you want, because it's in essence, it's forced change, right? It's not something you really wanted necessarily, and it's not something that you had anticipated, and yet here it is on your doorstep. And, I used to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it has undergone significant change since, I was a child. And eventually we moved in 2015. And part of it was just because it had changed so much, and it had become, cost prohibitive to live there. And, just the essence of it had really changed from what it used to be. And, I think that that's just true for so many places now. And there's a lot of people that are just moving to some place that they really feel like it sort of captures what they want their lifestyle to be. And I do wonder, like, okay, and as that secondary home changes, where are they going to go next, right? And so it's a sort of leapfrog or sort of bouncing that's really interesting. Pam's best girlfriend, Sally, died of breast cancer. It was 5 years before Pam would let another woman back into her heart. Sally's death had rocked Pam. It came only 8 months after her mother's death and only a few months before her divorce. Her husband at the time said, quote, "Well, you knew she was going to die for so long that you've done all your grieving. You should be fine from now on," end quote. So Pam took his advice and avoided everyone and everything, including potential friends. Instead of moving on, a slow and steady anger and a wall built up. She eventually told her therapist, quote, "There is value in the sadness. It can fill you up like happiness can, only in a different way. It's just part of being alive. And if sadness really doesn't kill you, then you're home free in every situation. Then no emotional risk is too great," end quote. So Pam, when she lost this beautiful friend, just, her husband was just really unsupportive and was just like, well, you've already grieved, so just get over it. And yet there's Pam, who just was completely just overwhelmed by grief and sadness.
Well, and I think it seemed like when she's talking about value and sadness, I think when there's like a shared loss, like a friend or a family member, there is value in that sadness because it can be a time of reflection. It can be a time of unity. It can be a time of, reflection in the sense of what can I do with my life so that I value what this person has left behind. And I think the harder part of sadness is probably when it's not a shared sadness, when it's kind of this individual path. And I think that I find that I kind of tend to want to run away from that, or maybe avoid or ignore that individual sadness and try to, weather that storm. But try to help people who are in that shared sadness of a loss of a family member.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sadness is one of these really slippery slopes because I think that you have to grieve. If you don't grieve, it's going to just literally eat you from the inside out. And eventually it's going to get to a point where you can't cope anymore. And then it's going to blow. And when it blows, it's going to be uncontrollable. And then when that happens, it's going to have an impact that you just can't even fathom. So you have to grieve. On the other side of that, grief can overwhelm you if you can't control it. So it can be one of these sort of situations where you end up going so far inside yourself that you can't get out. And so, if you're going to allow sadness to overwhelm you, you also have to keep some kind of perspective going. So if you're walking that path alone, you've got to have some kind of sort of friends or family or interests or hobbies or things going on in your life that can kind of balance that sadness and that grief. 5 years after Sally's death, Pam let a new friend, Marilyn, into her heart. Quote, I finally gave up the death watch I should never have embarked on. I stopped with the yearly mammograms. I finally made a close friend. End quote. Marilyn and Pam met on the Cape, and they began to spend a week there every summer. Marilyn also came to visit Pam in Colorado. On the way back to the airport after one visit, Pam's husband was driving and kept asking Pam and Marilyn if they weren't going to say goodbye or some closing remarks to each other. He told them that for being such good friends, they were still afraid to express their feelings to each other. They reassured him that they were just fine. They had spent 7 days together, and the silence between them on the way to the airport was not because they had nothing to say to each other. It was because their relationship was not based on what they said or didn't say. Words were merely one conduit of their connection. So I was reading this and thinking, it's so true. There's some friendships that you just don't need to say anything at all. Or you need to say like 2 sentences or one very short text message. And it conveys everything.
Yeah, I was thinking about that silence when it's comfortable. It kind of symbolizes trust. And if the silence is uncomfortable or tense, that there's some element of kind of uncertainty or expectation or obligation that feels like you have to fill that silence.
Yeah, and I also think with a really good friendship, it's knowing when the silence is good and you don't need to fill it, and when the silence is the other person sort of begging you to ask more, or to sort of poke a little bit deeper.
Well, and it shows that Pam's husband didn't quite know the language of Pam and Marilyn yet, and so he was uncomfortable by their almost silence, but they knew that was a mark of their close friendship.
The Teton mountain range runs through Wyoming. The most formidable peak is the Grand Teton, standing 13,700 feet high. Known as the Grand, the peak is the highest in the continental United States. It draws the extreme outdoor adventurous, and at its base live the people with no home. The people who relegate real life to the few weeks in the spring and fall when the mountain is either still too snow-covered to hike or not yet snow-covered enough to ski. Quote, there was a time in my life when I was one of those people, when the rivers and the mountains spoke to me and I took on any challenge they offered, however ill-suited I might have been to the task. Now I have learned to be a little bit more selective about which challenges I accept. I know the mediums in which my body performs best, and they are soft ones: water, snow, the back of a particularly responsible horse, and the ones in which my body stumbles: rock, pavement, and anywhere more than 20 feet off the ground. End quote. And so it's interesting because we talked a little about the physical edge that Pam did, as she was younger, and then getting older, she kind of backed off. But she's also sort of learning, even on the physical edge, those things that she likes a little bit more and those things that she kind of backs off. So, she's starting to be a little bit more selective about things, and it's almost like finding that center, that balance.
I definitely have experienced this. Like, I think in my 20s and teens, I would go, especially from a physical standpoint, until my body told me, okay, you need to stop, or you get like sick as a dog, and you have to, be in your room for a week with the flu or whatever. But now I feel like my awareness, and also gratitude for when my body is feeling good, and also, trying to take steps so that I can feel good is more important, whether it's a fitness regimen or getting enough sleep. Or I found when I had a kid, I had to kind of schedule in boundaries around my work schedule so that I was kind of forcing a balance within my hours between work and home as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, when we look back at our college days, just cringe, right? I mean, it's like the all-nighters, like the horrific nutrition, I mean, it's just, oh, it's horrible. I went to a college where, I mean, they fed you a ridiculous amount of amazingly good food. So I don't think there was a freshman 15. I mean, I think it was a wee bit more than that. And it was just nonstop food all the time. And I mean, it was good, but I mean, yeah. And during finals, there was like snacks out all night. The soda machines were left on. I mean, it was horrible. And then, and then no one ever slept. I mean, it was just like, you could always find people awake. So, you didn't take care of your body. And some people, by the way, were amazing at taking care of themselves, and kudos to them. But I would say the vast majority of people just, you were kind of learning how to be an adult, and taking care of yourself wasn't usually real high on people's lists because, they were more interested in the fun and the adventure. And as you're saying, as you get older a little bit and become a little bit more mature, you start to realize, I wouldn't say the cliche, your body is a temple, but you start to realize if you don't take care of your body, you're not going to be able to do all those other things as well as you need to, or as well as you can. So you start to be like, oh, well, I got to take a little bit better care of myself in order to do all those other things that I want to do.
Well, one thing I was thinking about the other day was I actually didn't really discover coffee until I was out of grad school. And I'm wondering, how the heck did I ever make it through 6 years of school? Because I like didn't like coffee, and I don't know how I made it without caffeine. And I know you're not necessarily doing much caffeine these days, but it's kind of a staple. It's like a food group in my life right now.
Okay, first of all, what is wrong with you? Second of all, I mean, I like, for our listeners who know me from college, like, I literally had an IV in my arm. I mean, it wasn't a staple, it was an IV. I got off coffee this year on January 23rd. Not that I know the date, for a totally different reason. And I've now been off coffee. I haven't had any, but I know I drank it like it was water. And in grad school, in particular, I would literally like 8 to 10 cups a day. Law school depended on the season, but it was definitely at least like 8 to 10 a day. Iced coffee, regular coffee, it didn't matter. Favorite coffee is Dunkin' Donuts French vanilla with heavy cream. Not that that really matters. I also like Blue Bottle in San Francisco. Anyway, we're off topic, but coffee, yes, coffee, delicious. Not sure how you went through college. Maybe it's because you went to music college,
Yeah.
and so like it wasn't as much as like it wasn't an IV drip sort of situation. But yeah, I don't understand that. I don't.
Yeah, there was like, I think I probably wrote like one or two papers in undergrad, and I didn't have to do a whole lot of textbook studying. So yeah, it was probably just a little bit of a different world.
Wow, one or two. Okay, no. We're gonna have a whole podcast on college, college courses. Okay. Although Pam knew that being on a rock face more than 20 feet off the ground was not where her body performed best, she took on the challenge of learning to rock climb in the hopes of being able to climb the Grand. During her one-day course with an experienced mountain climber, however, she learned the difference between conquering challenges and pushing herself too far. Pam was not excited about climbing up the mountain in front of her, but she was about rappelling down it. But before Dick, her guide, would take her to climb the Grand, she had to demonstrate that she could not only rappel down it, but that she could climb it. She started up the rock face and became frustrated when she couldn't figure out a way to move higher. She told Dick to just bring her down, but Dick refused. He said, quote, "We all need challenges in our lives, Pam," end quote. As Pam begrudgingly continued to attempt to climb the rock face, she eventually realized that whether she made it up the rock or not, Dick was not going to take her to climb the Grand. With 100 feet of rock face still in front of her, she said, quote, "I don't know if you will understand this, but in my life right now, the bigger challenge is to say I'm scared. I don't like this, and I want to go down," end quote. So Pam got this great idea in her mind that she was going to go climb the Grand, and so she hires Dick to, basically does a one-day prep course, and he's like, "Well, I'm only going to take you if you are going to, we'll climb this rock face first and demonstrate, that you can climb, and then we'll rappel down." And Pam's like, "Oh, I'm good on the rappel, but, not so good on the climb." And then she gets halfway up, and basically she says, "I'm going to admit that this isn't for me." And, I was reading it and I thought, that was pretty brave. And it's a fine line between just giving up and then admitting that, something is just not the right fit or just not for you.
Yeah, I guess I could relate to. I feel like I make goals safely. We've talked about that before in other podcasts, but in that sense, sometimes I feel like I can foresee what something is going to be that I don't want to do more easily. But at the same time, like I'm in some things that I have to address. And I think the challenge sometimes is really committing to, okay, I'm going to tackle this, but it's going to take a long time. Sometimes those long game goals and challenges frighten me more than like the short-term ones.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, but I think there's also this little part that's, what is the purpose or the why behind the goal that you're making? And I think for Pam, this idea of climbing the Grand, I'm not sure she really knew the why behind why she was doing it. And I think that without that, when she says, "I'm scared and I'm going to climb down," she didn't really have a purpose for climbing. And so I think it was just admitting to herself, it wasn't the right time and space, and this wasn't really what she wanted to do. And so I think maybe it was more about that than it was about anything else.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that, sometimes something flashy or shiny attracts our attention, but we don't necessarily think it through as far as how it fits in with our personal why or goals. And so, in a way, she was probably really identifying the fact that she hadn't thought it through. And that's a hard thing. I know I want to be prepared and want to be, have thought things through before I attack them. So it's a hard thing to admit that you haven't foreseen the true implications of any decision you make.
I agree. And I think it's, even when you've just started down the road or, you've made public this goal that you're going to do or pursue, and then you realize, 5, 6, 10 days into it, you're like, wow, I did not think this all the way through. And then you sort of fall off the wagon because you just didn't, it was not what you thought it was going to be. And it's not a failure on your part. It's just you didn't do a good enough job planning. Every woman has 2 body weights. Some women call them the summer and the winter weights. Other women call them the diet and non-diet weights. But whatever you call them, you have them. Pam is no different. She lives in a 15-pound cycle between 145 pounds and 160 pounds. At the low end, she finds self-worth and happiness. At the upper end, she is cranky, depressed, and oversensitive. Growing up, Pam's parents constantly hounded her about her weight and made comments about other people getting fat. Desperate to please her parents, she began the endless 15-pound yo-yo that she still continues. At 158 pounds, she comments, quote, "I know there are countless professionals of varying reliability out there to help me restructure my relationship to food and weight control. But here at 158 pounds and holding, this is how it seems to me. I will never put a piece of food in my mouth without feeling guilty. I will never look in the mirror and feel okay about my body. And I will never, ever be at a weight, no matter how much I might one day lose, that I will consider ideal." End quote. Quote, "In just 1 year of my life, I managed to get a book of short stories published, run 7 of the country's most difficult rivers, lead a photographic safari in Africa, and teach a bunch of 18-year-old Mormon students to love poetry. Surely keeping off 15 pounds can't be harder than all of that." Old insecurities die hard. Even to this day, call me stupid and I'll laugh in your face. Call me a bad writer and I'll discuss art with you all day long. But call me fat and you'll send me sobbing to the bathroom and I'll wear tent dresses for the next 6 days. End quote. This weight insecurity is deep rooted and it's hard to reverse, I think, for 90% of women.
Well, and I think what she was also alluding to is it's such a fragile thing that you feel like there's these certain insecurities in my life where you feel so strong in so many areas. Like she was saying, like, look at these accomplishments. She's seven of the country's most difficult rivers that she's run in the rapids and led a photographic safari. I mean, she's accomplished amazing things. And yet we each have these like almost insignificant, but very, like you said, deep rooted and strong insecurities that they kind of fade into the background, but in an instant they can be brought to the foreground. And for me, it's not necessarily been weight, but I feel like I've always felt I am short. I'm 5'2", and I feel like I look very young, and also I'm not incredibly. I don't know. I don't like public speaking, but I feel like so much of me wants to be kind of that, almost like a CEO at giving a great, compelling public speech or something like that. But, I feel like I try to be a strong leader in the position that I'm in. And yet at certain times, I feel very like I will never, ever be able to accomplish that.
Yeah, I think it's difficult because I have definitely struggled with my weight my entire life. So I can relate to Pam's insecurity on this. And can relate to her yo-yo. But, I think at some point when you become an adult, and at some point in your journey, you got to find a weight that works for you long term. And that's not a yo-yo weight. It's, you got to find something that your body is comfortable in. And I'm just about there. It's got to be something that you're happy with and not something that somebody else is happy with. And I think that that's true for every insecurity we have, especially these deep rooted ones, right? You got to sort of figure out what's causing the insecurity. And then you got to figure out how you're going to deal with it in a way that's going to make it less impactful for you. Because people aren't going to stop commenting on it. They're not going to stop triggering it because no one knows that they're triggering it. So like in the example you just gave, Sonia, like, you want to be a really good leader and you want to be a really good public speaker. When people comment on things around your leadership style, they don't know that they're triggering that insecurity, right? So it's figuring out ways to improve your leadership, which you've done tremendously, to sort of counter those comments about the insecurity. So I think that works with weight. I think it works with a lot of different types of things. And I certainly have a whole laundry list, which we don't have time to go through, of a lot of different insecurities. And so I've been working through this idea of how do I work to make myself less sensitive to those comments that people are going to make.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. It's, there's, I can easily ignore or I can dwell on, the things that kind of trigger those insecurities. I mean, I could give someone the benefit of the doubt that they don't know that's an insecurity of mine, or I could, kind of hold resentment. So there's kind of a choice on my part as how to respond, especially in the light of people might, we don't necessarily know what everyone else's insecurities are. And it also brought to mind the impact of our actions towards people and how impactful they can be, even if we don't see that impact on the surface.
Yeah, and true story, I use a sliding scale. So the closer you are to like my nucleus of family or friends, the less room I give you to not know that it's an insecurity. So if you're my sister, you get very little wiggle room on not knowing it's an insecurity. If you're a friend I haven't talked to in an extended period of time, okay, you get a lot more room. But it is interesting how we judge people on comments that they make to us. So Pam had settled down with a loving partner in a home base by the time she was 35. She had her second book of fiction nearly written, and for the first time she thought she was ready to become a mother, leaving her adventurous travels behind. Fairly soon thereafter, Pam got pregnant. For a few weeks she was happy, but by the second month the depression had settled in. Her doctor told her mood swings were common, but she knew that this was more than mood swings. Quote, I woke up each morning and more sure that my life was over and that I had been handed a death sentence, and that even if I somehow lived through the pregnancy, the delivery, and the first few years of motherhood, my life would be devoid for all that time of everything I loved. End quote. Overnight, she'd become someone different, capable of less. Half a year later, she would learn that her irregular hormone levels were a recognizable condition, and that her repressed childhood memories were fighting their way to the surface. Quote, if we believe the theory, and I do, that we repeat our childhood traumas over and over as adults until we get them worked out, that it is at least one explanation for why I keep finding myself in the middle of all those tornadoes and hypothermic 3 a.m.s and all those near misses with grizzly bears. It also explains why I was so afraid to give them up. End quote. In the end, quote, the reason I seek out adventures that come equipped with their own natural disasters turns out to be the same reason I was so afraid to have a baby. There is one story of our lives, and we tell it over and over again in 1,000 different disguises, whether we know it or not. End quote. Pam eventually miscarried the baby. Quote, though part of my experience was sadness and loss, my overwhelming emotion was relief, like I had been given some kind of reprieve to figure out the answers to all the questions the pregnancy raised. Can I alter my definition of adventure to include sports that are several steps removed from real danger? Can I give my body 18 months to be heavy and out of shape without dissolving into self-loathing and disgust? Will motherhood turn out to be even more satisfying adventure than the ones I've had so far? Will I be able to work with my own childhood memories thoroughly enough to break the chain of violence and resentment that was so much a part of my past? Is it possible that in spite of, or because of, everything I've said here, the undeniable truth about me is that I can't now and never will be able to resist the sharp teeth of adventure? What I can say with confidence is that I'm working on the answers and will continue to, whether or not I decide to get pregnant again. In the meantime, I'm lining up a few more adventures. End quote. So here's Pam starting to settle down, and she gets pregnant, and she literally panics, almost panics herself into this depression, and then once in this depression, starts to spiral.
Yeah, and I hear, obviously that whole section that you just read is questions and questions. And sometimes we get into these places in our life like where it's completely uncharted territory for us. And, we have just so many questions. And I think that I heard a lot of fear in her voice. And in a way, maybe she didn't trust her own resilience, because I'm sure that in a way she had accomplished so many things. She could have had things gone differently. She would have definitely succeeded and persevered through being able to be a mother that was caring and loving and nurturing. But I wonder, did she not trust her own resilience after everything she had been through?
I think she was really scared. I think for so long she'd taken on all these physical adventures. She was kind of a wanderlust, and in a way she was really comfortable with those unknowns, every adventurous sort of thing she had done. But here comes a baby, and this is a life that now she's going to be responsible for. And I think that absolutely terrified her. And I think that, part of it was that she thought she was going to have to give up this adventurous life that she didn't realize that she was so attached to having. And this notion that she was going to have to transition to something entirely different was just absolutely petrified her. And then, she was dealing with what, all these repressed childhood memories or problems that were apparently, very psychologically impactful to her during the pregnancy. And I think it was honestly just overwhelmed her, and it was just too much for her to handle. And I'm sure she would have made a great mother. And she doesn't discuss much in the book about, what happened thereafter with respect to children. But I think there's a lot of mothers who get pregnant in circumstances that probably are less than ideal. And, who are scared about having a child and who turn into amazing parents. And, again, it's the fear of the unknown, right? It's like, how do you know you're going to be a good mother before you are a good mother?
Exactly. Well, yes, life is definitely full of those fears, and I've definitely reacted to those fears different ways. And I also related to her description of kind of this overwhelming relief when things kind of go almost sort themselves out. And I've definitely felt that relief when things I was anxious about kind of sorted themselves out in a way that frankly, I didn't have to deal with them on my own and initiate the change that I really wanted, but I was maybe almost too cowardly to initiate myself.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that relief. I've also felt that relief that like something that I didn't really want to have happen managed to just unwind itself. I call it naturally, but without me sort of having to take steps to do it. It just naturally unwound. Whether someone else caused it or something didn't happen that could have happened, and or everything just kind of ran its course, and then I just didn't have to make a decision, and it just and so yeah, it's relief. Um, but big life altering decisions, I've had a couple that just sort of unwound themselves, or sort of found their own way to a decision, and yeah, it's a relief in a way because you're like, wow, that sort of just, well, that just happened, and so we'll just go that way. And other times you have to sort of force the change, and I think Pam in this instance, it was both directions at the same time, and afterwards she was like left with this sort of pile of ruin, and kind of had to pick up the pieces. One of the stories that Pam tells in the book is about a trip that she took to northern Michigan. The purpose of the trip was to teach talented high school students from 41 states and 15 countries who were participating in a writing academy to develop their art. Pam was expected to read from her fiction books and to talk to the students about her craft. Every time she got on the phone with her host, however, all he wanted to talk about was fishing. When Pam flew up to Traverse City, she was greeted by a small committee of fit and weathered middle-aged men whose books were famous in their own right. The men were also teaching at the academy, but their passion was fly fishing. Coming right off her flight, Pam was trussed up in the fly fishing equipment and waders and was taken out in the middle of the night to go fly fishing. After all, the guys said, the lake ice was breaking and there was no better time to get in on the action. The men had clearly all fished in the area before, looking at the landmarks to their favorite fishing hole and commenting on the number of cars at each pullout at each landmark. Quote, the whole conversation is less like speaking really and more like singing, a song they've spent years and years of these cold spring nights together learning, nights anybody anywhere else in the world would call winter, nights filled with an expectation that can only be called boyish and shadowed by too much of the grown-up knowledge that can ultimately defeat men. Sometimes they remember I am there. Sometimes they forget I am a woman. I feel in those moments like they've gone undercover, like I've been granted security clearance to a rare and private work of art. And though I've always believed that women bond faster, tighter, deeper than men could ever dream of, there is something simple and pure between these men, a connection so thick and dense and timeless that I am fascinated and jealous and humbled, all at the same time. End quote. I thought it was really interesting that she sort of had this detached look at this just really amazing tight-knit group of men who were very famous authors who were together for this academy, but who obviously were very close friends.
I think that in a way it was that kind of detachment. For me, it showed that she was kind of still in this place of maybe loneliness or trying to look for that support network. But I think that I didn't see as clear a divide between kind of women and men in these situations. What I think she was also seeing was these men had this shared experience over a long period of time, and I think that those shared experiences are what really create the strongest bonds. And I don't know that there's necessarily a clear difference between how men and women react in those instances. I actually would disagree that women bond faster, tighter, and deeper in unless they've had those shared experiences. Because I think at my point in life, I think it's those shared experiences have created the deepest and most thoughtful relationships, as opposed to just being around women.
Yeah, I think maybe this is Pam's experience with women bonding.
Mm.
Certainly, it's interesting because I think if you replace the words women with men, in this scenario, in this fisherman scenario, I could see women being out doing the fly fishing and having the same bonding group.
Hmm.
I don't know that I would see a man sitting back and having the same thoughts, maybe, but I could see women bonding over the same type of shared experience. So yeah, I agree that. Um, you know, I'm not sure that it's necessarily a gender thing, but I'm not sure that Pam had seen as tight knit of a group of men that she saw with these fishermen. And in the book, it goes pretty far in depth into sort of the collegiality between these men, and they were almost in essence like brothers. And I think that she was just surprised by that a little bit, and just how tight knit they were. And so maybe that's part of, what she was expressing. Quote, I have spent too much of my life proving that I can be one of the guys, never saying uncle, never admitting I'm tired or hurting or cold. Tonight I am all three, but the thing that makes me nod my head and say, yes, I want to go back again and stand in that icy river, has nothing for a change to do with my father or my childhood or the things in the world I need to prove. It is the potent and honest feeling between these men that I covet, that I can't miss an opportunity to be close to. I have stumbled somehow into this rare pack of animals who know I am there and have decided anyway to let me watch them at their dance. I want to memorize their movements. I want to take these river nights home with me for the times when the darkness is even heavier than it is in this Michigan sky. End quote. And so again, here you have her talking about this pack and these guys and like you were saying, Sonia, obviously, it sounds like she's going through this period of loneliness and she's feeling this deep connection to these men and almost this support network or this sort of flash moment of life that she wants to take away.
And it also seems where before with Marilyn, the silence in their relationship was kind of a comfort. It's almost like she was in awe of the fact that this activity of fly fishing for these men was kind of the center of their interaction, and the silence within it, that's where they were finding their comfort. And that silence for her right now is uncomfortable, and there's tension in it.
Yeah, and I definitely think, I don't know that she drew the analogy clearly with, her and Marilyn's situation and yet the men out in the middle of the river and their silence. And I think she looked at it very, very differently. And yet you're kind of right. It was almost the same type of silence. I mean, caused by two very different types of things, but, the ability of the men to just sort of read each other and to be in the moment and to just be enjoying the moment in the river. And I think that was part of it for her to just watch them just enjoying just that the ice breaking and the fish running and that just exhilaration of just being there in the cold in the night and just living it. And I think she wanted to take that with her away for those lonely times that she had. Our listeners will remember Joan and Joni walking along the beach in Cape Cod in our podcast that we did about A Year at Sea. Pam found her Joni in a poet, Jane Hirschfield. Quote, my relationship with Jane is 2 years and a few dozen beach walks, horseback rides, and mud baths old. The relationship is deeply successful, like she would say, the relationship between these huge dark rocks and the silver waves that crash all around them. I bring Jane my wild tales of failed love and adventure, my passion and spontaneity, my questions about how to live my life. She meets these with a hard-won wisdom as rich and as peaceful as the pear trees in her garden, a wisdom gained from years of sitting on a small pillow in a huge Buddhist monastery, a calm I can only covet while my life tosses itself from storm to storm. End quote. Walking along Muir Beach, 20 miles north of San Francisco, Pam and Jane talk about redefining success. Quote, now I am coming to the understanding that success has less to do with the accumulation of things and more to do with the accumulation of moments, and that creating a successful life might be as simple as determining which moments are the most valuable and seeing how many of those I can string together in a line. End quote. There are moments when the challenge in front of you is obvious and the road to success is clear, but then there are the moments when the challenge is far less obvious or the moments of utter failure. Those are important too. And so as we're getting older and as Pam here is, getting more experienced, and she's talking about this sort of accumulation or this string of moments that actually leads to success rather than these sort of big bang moments or, these summits that she used to think.
I think also what she was drawing upon was those decisions that we finally feel like we can make for ourselves as we get older, whether it's, um, like she's contemplating what are the challenges that I find really meaningful in life? Is it being on the edge of these cliffs, or is it kind of these relationships that she's really trying to build in a meaningful way in her life? For me, I feel like as I've grown older, it's also about what battles am I going to pick to put my energy into. And I feel like I'm able to let different things go than I was able to, let's say, in my 20s.
Yeah, and I think that she's also talking about the fact that, failures sort of our view of failures changes as we get older as well. And, failures become part of our successes in a way, because with each failure we actually learn something, right? And it no longer is this catastrophic loss. It's almost part of our road to success. And we're more likely to kind of just let the failures kind of wash over us and just keep sort of plowing along, I think, than we were when we were young, and when they would make us kind of pause and stop and worry.
I think, like you said, these failures, they become almost more valuable in a way. And for Pam, it seemed like she was able to string those along on this kind of line of her life, and she saw those failures next to her successes as almost equal.
Yeah, and I really felt, as the book went along, she got not a maturity, but she got definitely a different perspective, where it was almost a more comprehensive or cohesive view of life, that it wasn't just this sort of one-dimensional, I'm going to go summit mountains, I'm going to go traverse rivers, I'm going to go, conquer these physical challenges. It became more, as we had talked about earlier, about all these different types of edges that she was going to go encounter and going to work through, and the different challenges in life that she could have, and how all of those would sort of work together to create sort of her life experiences. And on that note, that's all we have for today. Thanks for listening to Pam's story and sharing this experience with us. You can interact with us, follow us, and learn about our upcoming episodes on our website at modernathenas.com, our Facebook page under Modern Athenas, our Twitter at Modern Athenas, and our Instagram at the Modern Athenas Podcast. We would also appreciate if you could support our podcast by leaving us a review on iTunes or Stitcher and subscribing to the podcast. In our next podcast, we will be discussing the book Irina's Children by Talar Mazzio. As we leave you today, we want to remind you to never forget that each of you, like all of the modern Athenas we have discussed on our podcasts, has the power and capacity to be a change maker in your world. Work hard, dream big, and reach for the stars.